Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session. This is Reimagining Partnership, the Evolution of Stakeholder Relations on the Path to Zero Deforestation. And we have a tremendous set of folks to engage in 3 stories this afternoon about how companies and stakeholders are engaging to further the process quite rapidly and quite successfully, but with plenty of territory yet to cover towards zero deforestation. My name is Bill Shireman. I am very privileged to be president of Future 500, a nonprofit that does engagement between corporations and activist stakeholders, between groups that love to often hate and demonize one another. We also are increasingly working between Republicans and Democrats, kind of moving ourselves up toward the Middle East and global peace. We work often on a wide range of issues, from chemistry to conflict minerals to forests, of course, to a dozen different energy battles, to Bangladesh factory issues and so on. But we got our start organizationally in the rainforest. 20 years ago or so, our organization began as a consequence of a conflict between, at that time, the Mitsubishi companies and Rainforest Action Network, who were engaged in a battle, a boycott against the company to try to drive better rainforest practices. And I had my opportunity to do what Dean expressed a little bit earlier he was able to do, to actually visit the rainforest. In the process of visiting the rainforest, we discovered some of the things that companies can do to help protect the rainforest. But we discovered something else that was even deeper, and that is the lessons we begin to get from the rainforest about how we can save ourselves. The rainforest is a complex adaptive system. It is the most creative and innovative system on the face of the planet. It is the place where 2/3 of all biodiversity emerges. It's the place where the human species itself emerged. And yet, it's a system that is constantly facing an energy shortage, a resource shortage. And so when we look to the rainforest, we see not only an ecosystem that can be protected, but also we see a system that we can emulate ourselves. And the battles that are going on between often the business community, the activist community, indigenous and local communities over forests, in a way, what we're seeing is a simple jungle right now, a young forest. And in a jungle, a few species are competing for the same ground. They're competing to use that ground in the way that they prefer. And what happens over time in that process of evolution is that these species that are at battle begin to adapt and begin to evolve and begin to fill particular niches. And so over time, from combat emerges a kind of collaboration where all the species are intertwined, each one serving a particular role. This is something that is encouraging to us because it means the evolution from a system of survival of the fittest to a system where it's the survival of all who fit. And I think we saw that a little earlier with some of the discussions about moving from a generic standardizing economy to an economy where a great deal of diversity fits. What we have on the panel here are a set of groups that have found their niches. We have 5 people, 5 organizations, 5 species, if you will, that engage together to find common ground. And we're going to tell 3 stories with these folks in the next hour. We're going to hear from Dean Scarborough, the CEO, as you heard a little earlier, of Avery Dennison, and from Tensie Whelan from Rainforest Alliance. And they're going to tell us a bit more about the work that they are partnering on in Latin America. Work that began not as a consequence of a conflict, but as a consequence of engagement and a visit to the rainforest. Then we're going to hear a little bit from Aida Greenbury with APP. Some of you participated in a discussion yesterday, and Amy Moas from Greenpeace, to talk about the more classic form, I suppose you might say, of conflict between those groups, and then an emerging collaboration among them. And finally, we'll hear from Glenn Hurowitz from Climate Advisors, who will discuss the absolutely remarkable series of dominoes that have been falling, if you will, among companies that are now making commitments to the emerging mandate, if you will, of zero deforestation. Just tremendous progress that's being made. I don't want to overstate the progress. There's plenty of gaps that remain. There are plenty of companies that are not yet participating in that, but we certainly have seen progress happen. So first, let me turn to Dean and to Tensie, and to just ask, how did this relationship between your organizations emerge? You talked a little bit about it earlier, and where is it going now?
Well, I think I did talk about it this morning. We were struggling with a couple of issues. One was trying to resolve the conflict we had between trying to source sustainable forest products at cost parity, because we had been trying to do it for many years and we weren't being successful. And the second thing is that we engaged with Rainforest Alliance to help us write a responsible paper sourcing policy. And it's something we just had no experience in. We bought a lot of paper, we still buy a lot of paper, but we didn't really understand really where all the pulp and certainly where the trees came from. And so, Rainforest Alliance has really helped us do that. I actually had the opportunity to talk to Tensie on the phone. I think it was during Hurricane Sandy. So we were supposed to get together, but we were unable to do so. And I told her my dilemma, which was, I'm not sure how we get this done. And so she said, well, Dean, how big are you, and what's your position in the market? And she very nicely reminded me that as a market leader, we probably have some influence and power in the supply chain. And that was helpful. But definitely helpful, and definitely a wake-up call for me. But then she invited myself and some of my colleagues and some rainforest colleagues to visit rainforests in sustainable forest practices in Guatemala and Brazil. And as I said before, it was incredibly inspiring to see people use a forest responsibly and better their lives. And I realized, oh gosh, we can make a huge difference here and change the way our industry sources paper. So sometimes I tend to be experiential anyway as a learner, so it was an incredibly powerful experience for me both in Guatemala and Brazil. And we had a lot of fun too in the trip, so that was great, including a pretty tough pickup truck ride in the mud. And then as we were down there, we were talking about, well, what else can we do? How can we work together and help? Because we have a foundation, the Avery Dennison Foundation, that invests in education and sustainability. And we like to do it in places where we have employees so that they can engage as well. And so we just recently announced an investment in Honduras for $200,000 a year for the next 3 years to basically replicate some of the things that we saw in Guatemala in a country where we actually do quite a bit of business. And again, that's we're just getting started there. I've yet to get down there, but Honduras has a huge deforestation problem, and we want to help in any way we can. So I guess that probably a good start anyway.
Well, it's been really terrific getting to know Dean and the Avery Dennison team, and we definitely put them through trial by mud, because we took them on a Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, if you've ever read The Wind in the Willows, through like 10 feet of mud, and when they didn't fall out of the Jeep, I decided they could actually do something sustainable. So we the Rainforest Alliance, as you know, we work really to help encourage markets to help solve some of the problems that the markets actually create around sustainability. And when you look at what's happening in Brazil and Guatemala, Honduras, where we visited, you're seeing communities really put in place significant sustainable management techniques. So in natural forests, they're only taking out 4 trees a hectare. They're mapping every single tree in every single hectare, and they are making sure that they're not harvesting where there's wildlife, where there could be erosion, where there's important water supplies, et cetera. It's really intensive. And these communities, like the ones we saw in Guatemala, were selling their hardwood to the Brooklyn Bridge, where I live, right near there, which is pretty cool, to the Brooklyn Bridge Park. And what we're doing with Avery Dennison is encouraging two types of engagement with the forestry sector. One is with the big pulp and paper companies that provide fiber and material to Avery Dennison, like the ones we saw in Brazil, where they are now working with indigenous communities, because there's been a lot of conflict over resources there, where they're planting and maintaining native trees in areas where there's otherwise completely destroyed landscapes, right, as well as the pine that they need for the pulp. So encouraging and supporting those companies that are really making those kinds of investments is critical, right? And then the other part of it is helping these communities who are producing product that isn't necessarily going into Avery Dennison's supply chain, that's more tropical hardwoods and things, but because of Avery Dennison's footprint in the forest product sector, this is a way they can give back to those communities where they also have other operations. So, it's that kind of work that we really want to reward and support those producers that are making these kinds of investments for our future, because they're really stewarding the natural resources for us. So it's pretty encouraging to see.
Now, how do you, with a situation like this, obviously a company can come forward and make a contribution, a 3-year commitment, but three years is not enough, obviously, to sustain a rainforest and to restore rainforests that have been destroyed. How does a system like this begin to become sustainable itself?
Well, so I should say that much as we appreciate the financial support for the community forestry project, the real investment is the investment in their supply chain. So it's the commitment on an ongoing basis. They're now up to 50% Forest Stewardship Council certified in their label sourcing, and they're going to continue to keep doing that, right? So it's that ongoing commitment that they will, through their purchasing power, which is much bigger than their charitable power, be able to continue sustainable sourcing and continue that positive feedback. For the communities where they aren't buying from them, this is a way to support those communities.
Terrific. So it's really that the buying power and the leadership that they can show as buyers.
Exactly.
Now, we talked a little bit earlier about the leadership that you can show. You were 3 times your competition in terms of market size and impact. Tell us a little bit about the impact that you have had in the market.
Yeah, it's been, it's interesting because the biggest challenge for us has been the fact that we're actually not getting a lot of market pull from this, from our customers or our customers' customers. In fact, one of the reasons that we're here at Sustainable Brands is to try to send the message that you can buy more sustainable labeling and packaging materials at cost parity or price parity. And we think that's a really important thing to do. Because we intend to be in business for a long, long time, and we want to make sure that we have access to renewable sources of paper. It's just critical to us. So that's part of the driving force. But what I found, I have to say, is that I would say 90% of the paper companies that we've dealt with and explained the situation have been very supportive. Mm-hmm. Okay, and our biggest medium-term challenge is getting more sources of FSC certified pulp into the chain. And that's where we really need Rainforest Alliance to help us. We need
right now you're not
people
getting
to
enough
do that.
FSC. You don't have the supply to cover all of the...
No, the biggest issue is in the U.S., actually. We can do it in Europe. We can actually get more of it in Asia. And the U.S. has been the toughest challenge for us.
Should give a shout out to Domtar, who's here, who's a big provider of FSC certified, made that kind of commitment. So.
Agree.
Now, one of the interesting attributes that I think Rainforest Alliance has had is that you're widely respected, both on the activist side and on the corporate side. You're one of those groups that when we go to activists and talk to them, they rely on your evaluations as a credible sign, even though you're doing work and you're being paid by companies that are involved in timber harvesting. How is it that you're able to fit that niche and receive funding from companies and yet maintain trust, generally speaking, on both sides?
It's a balancing act. So I figure when everybody's mad at you, you're doing the right thing, right? So sometimes that happens, it feels that way. But I think we're, mission is first. Our mission is to protect the world's biodiversity, to provide sustainable livelihoods to people. Integrity and credibility is part of that. We're pragmatic, right? So Greenpeace and Rainforest Alliance will agree most of the time, but not all of the time, because we might be a little more pragmatic than they think is right, and I respect that, right? And I think I won't speak for you.
No, we agree. We respect you too.
So it's a question of making sure that we're out there in the field assessing and listening to people, so that we go out and work with stakeholders, and you'll be talking about this later, but to look at what the practices are of the companies. We have auditors who are credible and respected, and we make sure that we listen to Greenpeace and to companies and to others to sort of pull together what's actually happening, right? And even more importantly, hear from the local communities themselves about the experience they've had with a particular producer there. So we audit when we go out. We're auditing, throughout each year. We're got people who are trained in social issues, environmental issues, economic issues. So they have a real strong background in what to look for.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I want to turn to another story, and I'll begin with our own story a little bit. As I said, Future 500, we end up working with many companies on many different types of issues. And a couple of years ago, we were approached by a couple of major brand name companies who had Greenpeace and Rainforest Action Network protesters either descending from their building, hanging banners, or doing various engagements. And they came to us and they said, well, it apparently has to do with this timber that we're getting, or our suppliers or our licensees are getting from the rainforest in Indonesia. We need to understand this. And so we helped them to develop, similarly, a paper procurement policies that delisted a few companies, including the company of this nice woman right here from APP. Now, APP responded to that pressure by making some quite dramatic changes in their supply chain on February 5th of 2013, which is now a date that I think is recognized and talked about within the activist community as a turning point. And I wonder if we can hear from Aida and from Amy the process by which Greenpeace and APP became not combatants in this, but collaborators to some degree, and with Greenpeace serving as kind of a check, a watchdog, and validator of the process. Can either of you tell a little bit about that story?
I think the process started when we stopped demonizing Greenpeace, and Greenpeace stopped demonizing us, and we started talking to each other as human beings. Started probably in 2012, early 2012. And it also started when we start working with the Forest Trust, where they play the role as the mediator or translator between the two species. Because Greenpeace is speaking Greenpeace language and APP is talking speaking in corporate language. There are areas that we didn't understand. That's the role where the Forest Trust play to translate the meaning of deforestation. What is zero deforestation? What is the expected actions that our stakeholders want us to do? And that conversation and discussions with Greenpeace, the Forest Trust, and a number of other NGOs is what led us to come up with the forest conservation policy, or is a zero deforestation policy. Maybe I need to explain a little bit more what is zero deforestation, because all of you, Dean and Tensie already explained, and I'm sure you're all aware what FSC is. But what is zero deforestation? Is it another certification, or what is it? So zero deforestation is a new initiative that is going to be our new business as usual in Indonesia. Ours is in Asia Pulp Paper, because no other players have adopted that yet from pulp and paper industry. So it's our new business unusual, and it's zero deforestation is beyond turning off chainsaw, it's beyond turning off bulldozers from converting or cutting down natural forests. It's beyond that. It's about identifying forest and peatland, because peat is very important, is as important as forest. So identifying forest and peatland and how to protect the identified forest and peatland and enhance the values. So it's beyond turning off chainsaw. And it's also about respecting community rights. It's about implementation of free and prior informed consent. It's about social mapping. It's about resolving conflicts, because in my country, Indonesia, and it's also a lot of it, other developing countries, social conflicts is very common. So that's what zero deforestation, and we also use a multi-stakeholder and landscape approach in implementing zero deforestation. So when we identify the forest, we need to identify not only the forest in our concessions, but also identify the forest in the surrounding areas and how to enhance the values.
So it's a systemic approach. It's not just stopping forestry in natural forests, although that's the fundamental, but it also involves a systemic approach to respecting community interests and ecological interests in the region. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. And the most important thing is defining what forest. What is forest? Every country, ITTO, FAO, everybody have their own definition of forest. What is the definition of forest that everybody must understand and agree with? I mean, even FSC, I think, has a quite limited definition of forest. That's where we work very closely with Greenpeace, and because the Greenpeace team under Grant Rosamond, they introduced the high carbon stock program or idea in defining what forests that need to be protected. Because up here you have the high conservation values, and then you have wasteland. So where between high conservation value and wasteland that need to be protected? Maybe you can convert wasteland into plantation, but where does it stop? Where does it start? So we need to define where is the definition of forest and what is not defined as forest.
So Amy, what's been your experience as you shifted from being a campaigner, really campaigning against companies like APP and April and others, to more collaborating with the companies that are making the change?
I hope you all in the room can appreciate how historic it is that, a company like APP, whose entire business model is predicated on encroaching into the forest and creating pulp and paper, right, cutting down trees, can actually sit up here and completely change the way that they're doing business in Indonesia. It wasn't an easy, yeah, thank you. So Greenpeace has a goal globally of reaching a world where deforestation doesn't exist. And so at a time, the best way to achieve that was through a very conflict-laden campaign against APP and against the customers that were buying paper from APP. So a number of consumer-facing companies, some that are in the room, were the target of Greenpeace campaigns. In the end, dozens and dozens of companies canceled contracts with APP. And in the end, we arrived at February 5th, 2013, when we really did turn over a new leaf with this company, and what was best for the forest became not this conflict, but actually became collaboration. So, going from a campaigner where I orchestrated big campaign events to actually collaborating with APP. It really is a historic opportunity to have a company like theirs actually change the way they do business on the ground in Indonesia. So we all have a vested interest in seeing them succeed. Not all companies in Indonesia are the same, right, as APP. She mentioned that no other pulp and paper company has made a similar commitment, right? So there's other companies that are actively destroying the rainforest. April is just one of them, Bill mentioned. Asia Pacific Resources International Limited, actively destroying the rainforest today to sell you all paper. Right? If you saw the protests out on the boat against 3M, or out when you were coming into the conference center, that's all about 3M sourcing from Asia Pacific Resources International Limited, right? So we really do have a vested interest in having APP's new model really succeed so that we can convince other companies that are still relying on rainforest destruction to change the way that they do business.
Now, a lot of the groups, a lot of the companies that we work with, we, we're involved in a battle where they may have been attacked by a Greenpeace or a similar group. And they say, well, we'll engage with a lot of folks, but Greenpeace or these groups, their interests and our interests are fundamentally at odds. What they're demanding is fundamentally undoable, impossible. We can't be done, therefore there's no reason to engage with them. I'd like to hear from Aida. First of all, what did you think of Greenpeace's initial demand set? Did you think it was reasonable, realistic? Did you think it was...
Totally crazy.
But if a company like APP can do it, anybody can, right? That should be the takeaway.
I mean, literally, it was we couldn't understand the demands, and we thought that Greenpeace was out there to destroy our industry, to destroy pulp and paper industry in Indonesia. That was our initial thoughts a couple of years ago. But again, somebody like the Forest Trust who could actually translate those requirements or new initiatives really help us a lot to understand what it actually means. And a different agenda, I mean, I don't want to talk about other NGOs, but we were so confrontational with Greenpeace, but working with them inside, it really opened our eyes, and not just me, but also our shareholders as well, because we do have shared value, we do have common agendas. Mm-hmm. So that's what we are focusing on and try to move forward together.
Wasn't it difficult, though, just emotionally to come from a point where these groups are demonizing the company and saying things that are quite disturbing, to then be able to sit down with them without that emotion undermining the relationship?
It was difficult initially, but we kept trying. We didn't give up. We give them information that we never share with anybody. We give them confidential data we never share with anybody, and ask their advice in implementing our strategy. And they've been respecting the process until today, and we're quite pleased with that. With that journey, that's where trust was being built and is being built right now.
Yeah, so Greenpeace likes to say that we don't have any permanent friends or permanent enemies. So, at a time, APP was about as bad as it got. And today, it's very different. And so we're happy to take on this new role with APP. It's probably important to note that, Greenpeace doesn't take one dime from companies like APP, any company or governments. All of our work really is about our mission and the forest. We never signed a formal agreement with APP. We don't have an MOU, right? It really was about establishing the trust between the two entities and working together for something that we both had interest in achieving. And that's an important distinction.
Great. So, Glenn, I want to ask you a little bit about the process of change that's been happening throughout. Yesterday, we had a discussion on supply chain leadership, and I made note of a quotation from a revolutionary of about 100 years ago who said, "For decades, nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen." And I kind of feel like that's been your life just recently, that you and your work have been reaching out to, collaborating in conflict, in collaboration with a whole series of companies who are gradually shifting their position. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's true. We are really in the midst of a revolution in terms of how raw materials are produced. And up until now, too many of them around the world have been produced through deforestation and other ecologically damaging processes. But over really just the last few months, over the last year and a half, I'd say since APP made its announcement, we've seen big change. And let me tell you about one example of that, and perhaps the biggest example. We focused initially on the palm oil industry, which is the biggest driver of deforestation in Southeast Asia. And for those of you who don't know, palm oil is an additive in a lot of consumer products, soaps, shampoos, donuts are fried in them by Dunkin' Donuts and Krispy Kreme. And So many forests had been converted into plantations that there are only 400 Sumatran tigers left. Orangutan populations were in free fall, and increasingly the palm oil industry was exporting its business model of deforestation, cheap land, and cheap labor to new frontiers like Africa and Latin America. There had been important but limited progress. So as a result of a Greenpeace campaign focused on Nestle and Golden Agri-Resources, Golden Agri-Resources, which is the largest private sector producer of palm oil, had adopted a no deforestation policy for the plantations where it grew palm oil. As important as that was in showing that this was possible, that you could have large-scale commodity production free of deforestation, they only accounted for 5% of global production. And if we went producer by producer, it was going to take a very long time to stop deforestation and transform the industry. And meanwhile, we're losing forests and peatlands and wildlife at an incredible pace. And so what we did is we went through an analytical process to identify who is the player that can really transform the industry in one fell swoop. And we found this one company that very few people in this country have heard of, which is called Wilmar International. It's Asia's biggest agribusiness company. It controls 45% of global palm oil trade. It's also the biggest soybean importer into China, and one of the world's biggest sugar companies. And it seemed to us that they were uniquely positioned to transform not only the whole palm oil industry, but potentially agriculture more broadly. And so we, Wilmar is opaque and had a reputation as a conservative company, and it's in Singapore and had not been traditionally very responsive to NGO campaigns or efforts. So we looked around and tried to find a way that we could influence Wilmar. And we did it through a lot of different ways, and we had a lot of great allies in this work. But one of the things that we did is we launched a big campaign with allies called the Forest Heroes Campaign. And we deployed online alerts. We recruited thousands of volunteers all over the United States and other parts of the world who focused on Kellogg's, because Kellogg's had launched a joint venture partnership with this company, Wilmar. And Wilmar was ranked 500 out of 500 by Newsweek in terms of its annual rankings of major companies' sustainability. So this was a company that was behind India Coal, China Coal, Monsanto, ExxonMobil, really the worst of the worst. Fortunately, this was after APP had made its announcement and vaulted, I'm sure, many steps in the rankings. And suddenly, Kellogg's, which is a well-known brand around the world that really prizes its image for responsibility and sustainability, had gone into bed with literally the worst company in the world. And so we sent our activists out, and it really, I think, had a very sudden and big impact on Kellogg's. Every time their recruiters went to a campus, they found students saying, we don't want to work with you if you're going to get into bed with Wilmar. Investors were asking their CEO about this. And initially, Kellogg's response was to think, why us? We use just 0.1% of the world's palm oil, relatively small amount compared to some other big brands. Why are you picking on us? And I think through our eventual dialogue that we started with them, what they realized and really embraced is the idea that it's not just about your own supply chain. It's not just about the specific, how much you do in one particular commodity. It's about your leverage and about your relationships. Your symbolic power is much greater than your supply chain power. And they did some things to reform their palm oil supply chain, but the way they had a really big impact was by the CEO picking up the phone and calling the CEO of Wilmar, and by persisting on the staff level and through other means. And during our negotiations with Wilmar's CEO in Singapore, he kept talking about how much he was hearing from Kellogg's. He showed us pictures of events that we had organized where we had 80 people show up in tiger costumes outside Kellogg's headquarters on a cold winter day in Michigan in Battle Creek. It was a way that Kellogg's was able to have a way outsized impact. And so, 0.1% of the palm oil supply chain was able to leverage 45% of the palm oil supply chain to announce a no deforestation policy. And then when Wilmar did this and announced no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation policy, they applied it not only to their own plantations, but to all their third-party suppliers. More than 90% of palm oil companies sell to Wilmar. And it also applies to the sugar and soybean industries. And so it's having a really transformative impact across the world. since Wilmar has made its announcement, it's been amazing to me that all these consumer companies have now announced their own no deforestation policies, either for palm oil or across all different commodities. And we've seen a pace of about one announcement every 2 weeks since Wilmar's announcement from major consumer companies. Here's the thing. Asian companies are actually leading the way. APP, Golden Agri-Resources, and Wilmar were the first ones to make these big no deforestation announcements. We've seen Mars and Kellogg's and Johnson & Johnson and many others follow, and that's fantastic. But as an American, I've got to say, it's time to keep up, guys. And really, global big consumer companies should be taking more of a leadership opportunity. And the way to do that, I think, is not just through acting in your own supply chain, but actually thinking about what are the big leverage points you have to transform entire industries.
One of the things that's been most exciting to us over the years as we've done this work is we've seen, I think, what the truth, this is kind of a backwards way of saying it, but the truth of the myth that companies just exist to maximize profit. I think that that's a terribly self-destructive myth. And our global chairman, who is the former chairman of Mitsubishi Electric here in the U.S., Tachi Kiyuchi, likes to say that the purpose of his business is not to profit, but that profit is what enables him to advance the purpose of his business. The profit is an enabler, not the end of the company, that all money is used to buy something, and some of that is having an impact. And the sense that I've gotten is that CEOs like Dean, senior executives like Aida, the folks at Kellogg's and elsewhere, they are proud once they're able to actually have an impact on an issue that was completely confusing to them, that came from out of the blue. They're very proud of it, and they carry that forward, and they have an outsized impact. One company making a shift with 1/10 of 1% of the market can actually transform, in this case, 45% of the market. That's a tremendous leverage.
Yeah, I'll just jump in with the story that Glenn was saying, and just that, there are a number of consumer-facing companies represented in this room today, probably a ton of them that don't have zero deforestation commitments on the books yet. But as time goes on, right, every couple of weeks we're getting another one and another one. It really has become the new norm, right? Not sourcing commodities from deforestation will absolutely be what it has to happen in the future. So maybe this sounds like a whole bunch of, words you don't understand, or you don't know how it implicates your supply chain, but I'm telling you to, open up your mind to the possibility of the influence that you can have, right? One company, and really it was Kellogg, but there were dozens others that were talking to Wilmar at the same time, right? It's, just a few companies that have been instrumental in changing what's happening on the ground, right? We never would have gotten APP to change the way they do business if it hadn't have been for the big consumer-facing companies that dropped contracts with them. So really, the power that each individual company has may seem small, but together it's huge. And really, the responsibility for the forest is in your hands. And it's not just about trees, right? It's about the wildlife that call the forest home. It's about the local communities that rely on the forest for their livelihood. It's about climate change and the climate importance of forests. So just to throw that out there, that the power really is in your hands, and we're counting on you.
I know, Aida, that there's an initiative that you are just beginning as well to protect and preserve 1 million hectares of forest in Indonesia. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that initiative actually came after we announced our forest conservation policy, or our zero deforestation policy, in February 2013. Once we made the announcement and the real work began, that when I realized, and my team realized, like, holy, can I swear here? Like, this is the amount of challenges that we're facing is much bigger than we thought it was going to be. And we realized that by addressing one or two concessions are not really solving the issues. We need to address the landscape. That's when, at the same time, a number of NGOs under Environmental Paper Network also come up with their milestones for APP to achieve, and one of them is basically restoring natural forest or addressing past legacy in deforestation. And that's actually in line with what we had in mind as well. So after listening to a number of NGOs, including Greenpeace and WWF, of course, we finally came up with this new initiative to protect and restore 1 million hectares of forest in Indonesia, including in Sumatra, is actually under a lot of threats right now, and in Kalimantan.
So can companies potentially engage with you on that? Are there ways for companies to either add to those 1 million hectares or potentially participate in the process?
Yeah, we're still in discussion with quite a lot of stakeholders right now, including the government as well, because we will not succeed if it's not supported by the government as well. So we are trying to align our program with the existing mechanisms, such as reduction of emission from forest deforestation and forest degradation. So with this mechanism, we hope that more and more stakeholders will participate into us helping Indonesia protect and restore natural forest. How, I think we hope that we're going to announce it soon, because we need to consult with stakeholders on how to do this properly. Because protecting and also restoring forests in Indonesia is not just the responsibility of Asia Pulp and Paper. Yes, we're not going to shy away from our commitment to 1 million, but to protect this long term is everybody's responsibility. You know, you guys, you're also responsible for some deforestation happening in Indonesia and elsewhere as well. So everybody's responsible to protect and restore what happened in Indonesia and other countries.
Now, Tensie, I just wanted to ask you a question, because as APP has made its shift, you know, when activists see a company make a shift and they're used to thinking of it in terms of this is the villain, it's hard for them to see the company necessarily in a neutral or heroic role, and it's important for groups that are trusted by both sides to come in to help to validate. What's the role that you guys are playing now with the APP process of conversion?
Yeah, so we are working, our team of auditors are working to assess the implementation of the commitments by APP around protection of high conservation value forest, high carbon stock forest, around community and indigenous commitments, around restoration and reforestation, et cetera. So there's a whole host of very specific commitments, and we're out there looking at, I think, about half of the concessions randomly as we decide to go visit them, to assess compliance with the commitments that they've made, so that there is that third-party review. Yeah.
Terrific.
Can I add one
Yes,
other thing?
please do.
Just for the group here, if you're not currently sourcing out of Indonesia, but trying to figure out how you can make a difference as well, you know, 60 to 70% of the deforestation is caused by agriculture. So bringing trees back into agricultural landscapes, in addition to working with sustainable logging, preservation of high conservation value forest, et cetera, is really critical. Organic does not do that currently, right? So you want to, and organic does a lot of good things, but that's not one of the things that they do. So there's different choices for you as you're thinking about, all right, well, I'd like to do this commitment to no deforestation, to zero deforestation. How do I do that? And one way you can do that is if you're purchasing forest products through commitment to Forest Stewardship Council certification, or to companies that have validated commitments around zero deforestation. Another is to look at agricultural certifications that do that. So a little plug for us, of course. Rainforest Alliance certification has a no deforestation cutoff time for the producers. So you want to, there's ways that you can get those proxies that you can feel comfortable about in your supply chain by making those kind of commitments. And then you can also support those companies by supporting the work that they're doing around restoration, because I do believe that the commitment that APP is making to bring the forest back, that Avery Dennison is doing to help communities in Honduras, in addition to your own supply chains, you want to help bringing these trees back to the ecosystem for so many reasons. Climate change is one, but I can tell you in these agricultural landscapes around the world where we're working, you've got soil degradation, you've got water exhaustion, you've got people living with really low productivity on less than $1 a day because the environment is destroyed through the lack of trees is a huge part of it. So yes, I'm a tree hugger, proudly, right? But we need your help to bring those trees back to the ecosystem.
I was just going to add one quick thing about what APP is doing that I think is really a great model for sustainability and the new way that sustainability is done. I think there's been a lot of talk about working pre-competitively for sustainability, and I think there's perhaps some merit to that, that everybody adopts a basic standard where you're not cutting down forests or not engaging in some kind of other egregious environmental destruction. But what APP has done is they did their no deforestation policy, and then they went ahead and they used that not as a ceiling, but rather as a floor to go out and innovate. And announce something that's really now setting a high bar for industry. And we're hoping other companies will invest in restoration and conservation as well. I think if you look at the palm oil sector, what we saw was initially a lot of companies, the way they expressed their concern about this was by joining the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the RSPO, which unfortunately has been captured by some of the bad actors in the Malaysian palm oil industry and does things like certified destruction of so-called secondary forests and even high carbon stock peatlands. Now there's been an awareness that you can't just check a box with certification. In some cases, it can be a very useful tool to make sure that you're reaching your goals and representing your values. But in this new era, I think some due diligence is required. And what that means is companies shouldn't be afraid to innovate. I think innovation is necessary. So if your competitor adopts a no deforestation policy, go beyond it and follow APP's lead and announce a commitment to restoration. In other sectors, if your competitor says we're going to stop using tar sands oil in our fleet, that's a great thing and you should do that too, but go beyond that and talk about how you're going to launch a fleet of carbon-free electric vehicles. I think innovation and using sustainability as an attribute for competition can actually create not only a lot of change in the world, but a lot of business value as well.
One of the most encouraging things about the transformation that is happening here is that no laws were passed to create the change that's happening. Of course, there are laws that help to contribute to the process, but this was all done in the free market, in the relationships between these entities that have their own sources of power. And we know that when we look at the political process, it's a highly gridlocked process. It's not a process that when it does come forward with rules and regulations, they tend to be very rigid. They tend to be pretty, much tied to maybe the lower performance levels and so on. At the same time, it is necessary to have a structure of laws within which companies can compete on a level playing field in ways that advance the interests of the whole community. Glenn, can you tell us quickly, because we're beginning to run out of time, what kinds of policies are necessary to create that framework?
Well, there's a lot of them, as I'm sure you can imagine. One of the critical things that we think is necessary is for a joint implementation body that involves government, companies, civil society, and the public to look at these no deforestation commitments and other sustainability commitments, provides monitoring, draws on satellites, draws on the ground monitoring, so that every company in this room and beyond knows what's actually happening on the ground. When we talk to consumer companies, one of the things we hear a lot about is Wilmar really implementing its policy? Is GAR really implementing its policy? The answer is yes, they're doing a good job, and APP is too. There are gaps. Wilmar alone has over 400 suppliers. When we see problems, I think the model has been to just provide private data. What we need is government to be involved, not only in providing that data, but enforcing it so there's a level playing field. There's a number of other policies that I would encourage companies to really take an active role in making sure that governments do adopt this, so that you have the knowledge and the certainty that everybody's playing by the same rules and that things are actually getting done. One of the things that we'd like to see is expansion of the principles of the Lacey Act, which prohibits import of illegally logged wood and paper into the United States. Similar laws exist in Europe and Australia. We'd like to expand that to other commodities. I think obviously in the forest nations themselves, there's a huge need for reform. Better enforcement, but also things like allowing companies that have forest concessions that want to conserve to not lose it if they don't convert it into a pulp and paper plantation or a palm oil plantation. Some of the concessions in Indonesia, actually, they're conditioned on the fact of development. And so if you don't change that, you're going to lose out. And then the one global thing that I think is really important that we desperately need in the United States, but a lot of other countries should adopt it as well, is a price on carbon. And this will not only cut pollution from coal, oil, natural gas, and sources like that, but it can actually generate revenue that can be spent to conserve forest. And really, it shouldn't only be, I think the private sector does have a lot of responsibility to repair past damage, but we need to have large-scale, government-scale investments in forest conservation. And I just conclude by drawing your attention to something that the IPCC report talked about most recently, that just came out, and it talked about the severity of the climate crisis. But in there, it said that between 20 and 60% of the near-term solution to climate change actually comes from forests and land use. And so this needs to be a priority for investment and policy change and conservation. And it's happening through the private sector, but the public sector needs to step up and be a partner, and that's not going to happen until private sector players take a much bigger role in advocating for a price on carbon and for action on forests.
A number of companies are actually imposing their own internal price on carbon in the absence of public policy. I know probably half a dozen companies in this room are doing that. Dean, I wonder what's next for Avery Dennison. Where do you, and I know you're kind of looking for direction in a sense, but where do you intend to take the company in this arena of both forestry and sustainability more broadly?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. We're still pretty early on in the journey, and just the notion that we can get 40% of our paper FSC certified in the first 12 months, I'm stunned by, inspired by it. And we're actually going through a process right now with Natural Logic and a group of employees inside the company trying to lay out some goals for 2025. So, I'm actually curious about, well, what does a Deforestation Pledge mean? Okay, it's kind of running through my head because I don't actually understand it, because I still have to buy paper for my business, so I don't know what it means yet. And it's something that we'll definitely be exploring and looking at. I think, we also buy films and we buy a lot of chemicals. And a few years ago, I had this problem with using food sources as raw materials, because I think that's just bad policy. And so, the other things we're starting to explore are there other ways for us to innovate around materials and material science in a more sustainable way, I would say in the chemicals and the films area, because that's a big part of our business.
It's interesting you talk about innovation, because as we work between also Republicans and Democrats on these issues, innovation seems to be an area of surprising common ground. That we saw a little earlier, the information from Andrew Winston about the 6% solution, if you will, if we can improve our resource efficiency. And Republicans look at this as resource productivity, the amount of value you get by 6% a year. Others say 3% a year, whatever the number is, a reasonable amount each year. Then you're able to cut carbon and produce prosperity at the same time. So really, we don't have to shut down the economy in order to save the environment. Innovation is a part of them.
6% a year when you compound that over a couple of decades, is a huge amount.
Yeah.
I wish that my investments all paid back at 6% a year. So,
well, it's in the 1900s we improved labor productivity 4% a year, 4 or 5% a year consistently. So we were 14-fold better, more productive with labor by the end of the century as at the beginning. And this century, all we have to do is get 10-fold better with energy and resources, and it is doable. But it's that incremental progress. That
can I ask Tensie to talk about deforestation, since I have her right here next to me?
Sure.
Thanks. Well, so you were asking, Dean, about what is zero deforestation? I think it's important because it does sound like, oh, we're not cutting down any trees, and that's not the case, right? So when you look at what is the component of a commitment that you might want to make, you want to, one, not cut down important high conservation value forest, or peat in Indonesia, for example, anything that has very strong ecological values and that has also strong potential for carbon emissions, which is what peat has a very huge contribution to greenhouse gases. So you want to look at that. Then you also want to look at, in your supply chain, how do you ensure sustainable forest management of those forests that are being cut down for your supply chain? And then you want to look at restoration, and you want to bring trees to degraded landscape. What you want to be careful about is not saying, well, if we just go and chop down all the natural forest and then put plantations in instead, that's net zero deforestation. That's not what we want. So it's actually a fairly sophisticated set of criteria that one needs to look at. And I think it's something that makes it complicated for companies, but we're all here to help.
Yeah, I think I'll jump into really fast, and I think that people often ask this question: how are we going to have paper if we don't have a world of deforestation? And I think it's very important. I don't think we would have done our job today if all of you in the room didn't understand. Right? A natural forest is very different than a plantation. Right? The exact same species of tree planted in nice, neat rows. Is that a forest? No. Right? So you can continue to cut down trees in a plantation in a sustainable way, as Tensie was talking about, but what you can't do in a zero deforestation world is encroach into the natural forest, right? Natural peatland. So it's a may sound like a very complicated issue, and you'll hear people talk about how complicated it gets, but really at the face value of it, it's incredibly simple to understand. And
I want to make one invitation to folks in the room here. Tomorrow we're going to have a discussion, and what's the time of the discussion, Sarah? 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock tomorrow we have a discussion on policy and how companies can get involved safely in the process of identifying policies that create frameworks within which sustainability can happen profitably and to allow robust forest products sector and other sectors to exist. I want to thank a few folks. First of all, I want to thank my team at Future 500 up here who did, Sarah and Eric and Dana and others who've done a fabulous job with us in helping to put this panel together and a couple of other panels together that we're doing at Sustainable Brands. I want to thank Sustainable Brands, the gold standard in sustainability conferences and events and communities, because Sustainable Brands is a community of folks who are not just interested in meeting and talking, but actually producing change, and it's good to see the folks that are here that are about change. And in particular, I want to thank the people around the table here, because these are people that have discovered something that is deeply purposeful in their lives and for their companies. And I think you see the kind of energy that happens when people find that there is more to do than just maximize profit, that there is a purpose in our enterprises, that our enterprises fulfill something that's a deep need, and that as we begin to feel that, perhaps the satisfaction of doing a job well done becomes even more satisfying. These folks are working hard. I know this is really difficult work. The emotional strain that comes when you're actually dealing with folks that are at your throats, demonizing you, the ability and the character that it takes to turn around in that situation and be able to collaborate and to change your attitudes towards one another is really remarkable. So I want to thank all of you for the work that you do and thank all of you for coming. Thank you very much.